And it's called, It's Just Gonna Be One of Them Days. Have you had those kind of days? Well, it can't be any worse than the story I heard about the small town courtroom. And the prosecuting attorney is trying a big case. And he calls his first witness. She's named Miss Jones. And Miss Jones has been known in the community for years. She's been a beloved lady, Sunday school teacher. She's helped out in the food kitchen and the clothes bank. She has been involved in the lives of many of the children that grew up in this small town, much like my hometown of Caddis. Woohoo! Well, she's called up by the prosecuting attorney. And she's asked the first question. He says, Miss Jones, do you know who I am? And she says, why, yes, I know who you are, Mr. Williams. I've known you since you were born. And I have to admit that you've become a big disappointment for me. He's shocked by this. She says, yes, you're a big disappointment. She said, you lie, you cheat on your wife, and you manipulate people, and you talk about them behind their backs. You think you're a rising big shot when you haven't the brains to realize you never will amount to anything more than a 2-bit paper pusher. Yes, I know you, Mr. Williams. He didn't know what to say. This was one of his star witnesses. So he looks over at the prosecutor, or the defendant, and he says to Miss Jones, do you know who he is? The attorney over there. She said, oh, yes. I know Mr. Bradley. I, too, have known him since he was a boy. I used to babysit him when his parents would go out of town. I know Mr. Bradley, and he, too, is a big disappointment to me. Mr. Bradley is a drunk. He's a bigot, he has a gambling problem, and the man can't build a normal relationship with anyone, and his law practice is one of the worst in the whole state. But not to mention that he's cheated on his wife with 3 different women. Yes, I know, Mr. Bradley. At this, the court is just in an uproar, and the judge bangs his gavel, and he calls for the 2 attorneys to come up to the bench. And in a very quiet voice, but with feeling, he says, if any one of you idiots asks if she knows me, I will find you in contempt of court, and you're going to spend some time in jail. Sometimes you have one of them days. Disillusionment, when things don't go the way you think they should, or people don't act the way you think they ought. We are all disillusioned at times. It may be disillusioned by the school we chose to go to in college. It may be that first job that we got. We think it's going to be great and wonderful, and you find out after a while that it's going to be a whole lot harder, and people aren't going to be nearly as nice as you thought. It may be disillusionment in marriage. You think that everything's just going to be sweet and wonderful, and that person is going to look just as beautiful when they wake up in the morning as they did when they went to bed the night before. And we become disillusioned. However, when disillusionment appears in life, if we don't address it, it can lead to a dangerous downward spiral. In the life of a man named Judas, such a thing took place. We can take a look at the disillusionment in his life, disillusionment at its worst. In Matthew chapter 26, verses 14 through 16 that Ty read for us this morning, it says, then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what will you give to me if I deliver him over to you? And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray him. Judas who had spent over 3 years with Jesus Christ, watching him, listening to him, being loved and cared for by him, became disillusioned with Christ, became disillusioned with his faith, and was willing to betray the one who loved him more than anyone ever could. From examining the life of Judas, it seems that disillusionment can be broken down into a cycle containing 5 steps. This is what I call the downward spiral of disillusionment. And today I want us to look at the life of Judas and how this disillusionment took over his life, and he gave up his faith. And when you're feeling disillusioned in life, I pray that you can look back and see how Judas responded and do the opposite, so that you don't end up lost as he was. The first step that I see in Judas's life and in the life of those who are on this downward spiral of disillusionment is step number 1 is disappointment. In Mark chapter 14, verses 3 through 7, we kind of see this. It says, "And while he was at Bethany," meaning Jesus, "in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, 'Why was the ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor.' And they scolded her. But Jesus said, 'Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them, but you will not always have me.'" Judas was one of the apostles that was there that day. You see, Jesus was in the house of a leper, first of all, who secondly was a religious leader. And Jesus was willing to go where a lot of people weren't willing to go. And this probably bothered Judas, because he was hanging around. Jesus was hanging around the type of people that Judas thought he shouldn't be hanging around. He was in this house and reclining there, and a woman comes in and she takes a very expensive jar of ointment, a beautiful fragrance that was used many times on the body of those who passed away as a preservative to slow down the decaying process, or at least the smell of it. And she broke the seal and she poured it over the head of Jesus so that it caused a beautiful scent to be throughout the whole household. She did this out of love. She did this out of commitment, appreciation for Jesus. But in Judas's eyes, this wasn't right. He looked at things in a physical sense. He looked at it that, oh, we could have sold that. We could have gotten money for that and used it for something else, rather than looking at it as this was an act of worship by this woman. You see, Judas's eyes, in his eyes, Jesus had the wrong agenda. In Judas's eyes, Jesus should have been a whole lot different than he was. And that brought about disappointment. There are some scholars that believe that Judas Iscariot, as he is called in Scripture, was what was known as a zealot. A zealot was one who was a rebel against the Roman army and the Roman government. They wanted Israel to be a strong nation as it had been under David and under Solomon. And they were looking for a Messiah that was going to be a physical king, that would bring them to prominence and that all the other nations would be defeated by them. That's how they understood the prophecies of the coming Messiah. Judas, in the beginning, I believe, believed that Jesus was the Messiah. I think he may have believed it clear up until the end. But he had a different idea of what the Messiah should be. He thought Jesus should be talking more about rebellion against Rome and getting an army together and followers and hanging around those people that had power and prominence and money. But Jesus was hanging around the wrong people. Poor people. Outcasts. That's what Judas thought. He was disappointed by how Jesus was doing things. And that disappointment started this spiral of disillusionment. There may be things in your life that you're disappointed about. Maybe things didn't turn out the way you thought they would. Maybe you're not in the place in your life today that you thought you would be at this stage of life. Maybe you've had bad relationships. Maybe you've had rough financial times. Maybe you've had health issues. And you're disappointed. And you're starting that spiral of being disillusioned with God and your faith and life itself. We need to learn from Judas's mistakes. We should not become disappointed. Judas believed Jesus had the wrong view on issues in life. After 5 years of therapy, a psychiatrist told his patient that they seldom use the term cure, but she'd been cured. To his surprise, the patient became obviously disappointed. The doctor asked, "What's wrong? I thought you would be happy and thrilled that you've been cured." And the woman replied, "Doctor, look at it from my point of view. 5 years ago, I was Joan of Arc. Now, I'm nobody." You see, we sometimes get the wrong idea of how things are going to be and how they should be. Judas believed that Jesus should have been doing things differently, and sometimes we think God should be doing things differently in our lives. And we become disappointed when things don't turn out the way we want them. Step number 2, disagreement. In Mark 14:10 and 11, we see that a disagreement's taking place between Judas and Christ. Because of the disappointment, a disagreement is now taking place because he disagrees with what Jesus is teaching and what he's talking about. That it's love, love, love. And that he's going to die. And his kingdom is not of this world. Judas disagrees with that. So Judas, I believe, wanted to push Jesus into being what he wanted him to be. He was pushing Christ into making that move to start this earthly kingdom. And the way he did that we see in Mark 14:10, 11. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought an opportunity to betray him. When Judas's expectations went unmet, he began to withdraw from Jesus and from the apostles. I don't know about you, but whenever I'm discouraged, whenever I'm feeling disappointed and I have a disagreement with someone, I avoid them. I don't want to talk about it many times because I don't like confrontation. Anybody here besides Jeff Ecker like confrontation? Confrontation is something that I don't like. I'm getting better at it as I'm getting older. I will deal with it, but I don't like it. And many times, a lot of us are that way. And I know there's a lot of people in this church that are that way. When we have disagreements, rather than going to the person and talking about it, we withdraw. We either don't come to church, or if we do, we stay in our own little corner, or we avoid the people we're having the issues with. That's what Judas was doing. He pulled himself away from the apostles. If he hadn't done that, he would have never betrayed Jesus. And many times whenever we find ourselves withdrawing, we find ourselves breaking relationships, which makes it easier to betray, makes it easier to hurt others. Judas didn't completely abandon Jesus or the others right away, but he began to keep them at arm's length. When I notice people in the church not here as often, or they back off of work that they're doing in the church, I know there's a problem. I know there's a problem. And when we look around and we see people that aren't here, that usually are, and we start seeing them a little less, or they're here but they're not here, you know what I mean? They're here physically, but they're not here emotionally, mentally. It's times like that that we need to reach out to them and try to find out what's wrong. Because this disagreement can lead to disillusionment, and they can lose a lot. Their faith, they can lose relationships. And there's a right way and a wrong way when there's disagreements on how to handle them. I once heard of a farmer who had a wife that was such a complainer. From sun up to sundown, all she did was complain. And this poor old guy had to deal with that. The only time he got any rest from it was whenever he would take his old donkey and go out to the field and do some work. So one morning, she's complaining, and he takes his donkey and they go out to the South 40 and they start plowing. Well, noon comes and here comes his wife out to him, bringing his lunch to him. So he takes the donkey and he ties him up to a tree. He takes his lunch and he sits down and he starts to eat. And as soon as he does, his wife's standing right there complaining. Well, after about 5 minutes of that, the donkey rears up with his back feet, and he hits her so hard she flies 20 feet in the air and drops dead. You think that's funny? At the funeral home, when calling hours is going on, the pastor's watching as the widower is greeting people when they come up to the casket. Every time he noticed that a woman came up to the casket, the man would listen intently and nod. But every time a man came up to the casket to talk to him, he would look at him for a second and go, "No." So after the service, he sat down with the man and he said, "John, I noticed that every time a woman came up, you listened intently and nodded, but when a man came up, you shook your head indignantly at him." I said, "What was going on?" He said, "Well, when the women would come up, I would listen to what they'd have to say, and I would nod when they would say, 'Your wife was such a wonderful person. She was a good cook. She was involved in the church and taught Sunday school, and you were just so fortunate to have her.'" He said, "Okay. But what about the men? What did they..." "Well, the men knew what my wife was like. And he knew that, and all these men knew how my wife died. And they would all come up and ask me if my donkey was for sale." When you disagree with somebody, be careful how you deal with it. Don't withdraw. Sit down and talk about it. Make the effort. That's what Jesus says to do. If your brother sins against you, go to them one-on-one and talk it out. And if it works out, then you've gained a brother back. If it doesn't work out, really, what have you lost? If you're already withdrawing from that relationship. And whether it's with someone else or with God, when we have a disagreement, we need to go to them and talk. When we've got a problem with the things in our lives and we blame God for it, don't withdraw from God. Don't quit praying. Don't quit reading the Bible. That's the time you need to approach God even more and say, God, I don't like what's going on in my life. I don't agree with what's going on here. I want to understand, and I want you to show me what I need to do and how I can deal with this. When we have disagreements, if we leave them undealt with, it can lead to a downward spiral of disillusionment. The third step is that of decision. Judas made a decision. In Matthew 26, 46 through 50, Jesus is in the garden after he has instituted the Lord's Supper, and he's been praying. And after he's done praying, he goes to his followers as they're waiting for him in the garden, and he says, "Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." While he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd of swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him." And he came up to Jesus at once and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and he kissed him. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you came to do." Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus, and they seized him. This was the pivotal moment. This was the point of no return. His disillusionment had dropped him to this point in his life, that he was willing to betray the Son of God. His friend, his teacher, his mentor. He was willing to turn him over to the authorities. Once Judas crossed that line, there was no turning back. His final decision catapulted Judas into a downward spiral that couldn't be reversed. Judas, I wonder if he thought he was doing the right thing. And some of you are thinking, how could he think that, betraying? I think he was trying to force the hand of Christ. He knew the power that Jesus had. I mean, after all, he saw him heal the sick. He saw him raise the dead. He saw his power and his majesty, and he believed in him. He just thought he needed a little kick in the seat to get him to use that power to usurp authority over Rome and to help Israel overcome its enemies. But by making the decision that he made, he condemned Jesus to death. We have to be very careful, folks, in the decisions we make and what bridges we burn in our lives. Be careful what you say. Because just like you squeeze toothpaste and that toothpaste comes out, once it is out, can you get it back in the tube? Oh, you may get some of it back in, but it's a mess. And that's what happens sometimes with the words we speak and the things we do. We make a mess of things. And then we try to put the pieces back together, but we can't. Be careful what you say. Be careful of the decisions you make, because some of the decisions we make are eternal in their outcome. When you get mad, don't just up and leave the church. Talk about it. Let us know what the issues are. How can anyone fix anything if we don't know there's a problem? Same thing with friendships, relationships with family, co-workers, people here at the church. If you've got a problem with an individual, go to them and deal with it. Don't make the wrong choice. Don't make the wrong decision, because many decisions are, as I said, eternal in their consequences. As we spiral downward and make decisions, they can change us and others for the worse. The fourth step is despair. In Matthew 27:3-4 it says, "Then when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, 'I have sinned by betraying innocent blood.' They said, 'What is that to us? See to it yourself.'" This is why I think that Judas didn't mean for it to go this far. Because when he saw that the die had been cast and that Jesus was in deep trouble, he felt remorse and he felt despair. Judas' conscience finally got the best of him. Judas was seized with remorse as a result of his decision. And because of this, he became in deep despair. Have you ever been in despair? Have you ever been so low in despair that you just couldn't even look up? You couldn't get up? You felt so bad. And you thought, I can never get past this. It's all over. My despair is so low. They can't love me. They can't forgive me. God can't forgive me for what I've done. And we give up. A preacher saw a man who looked like he was homeless sitting on a park bench, and he walked up to the man and he took out a $20 bill and he handed it to the man and he whispered to him, "Never despair." The next day the preacher saw the man running up to him, and the man gave the preacher $60. The preacher asked what was going on. Why was the man doing this? And the man said, "You were right. Never Despair came in first place yesterday, 6-1 odds in the fourth race." Judas tried to give the money back. You okay now, Donna? I love you, Donna. I love your laugh. He tried to give the money back to the priest because of his despair, but it was too late. It was too late. But that doesn't mean it was too late for Judas. In his despair, he could have said, "God, I have sinned against you. I am so sorry, God. Please forgive me," and could have repented of his sins, and he could have been forgiven. He could have come back to God. But he didn't. Despair got the best of him. And that's the problem when we get to that point. When we are in despair, we just feel hopeless. And I don't think there's a worse feeling than feeling you have no hope. But folks, let me tell you something. You've always got hope with Jesus. He loves you. He will forgive you of anything you have done, anything that you are presently doing, anything you will do in the future. All you have to do is come to Him, repenting, asking forgiveness, and giving your life over to Him, and making that change to follow Him. I know I talk to people a lot that have said, "God could never forgive me for some of the things I've done." Yes, He can. Yes, He can. He forgave the Apostle Paul when he was Saul of Tarsus. He was killing people, killing Christians. Have any of you done that? Have you persecuted the church? Have you shed innocent blood? That's one of the worst things we can do. But he was forgiven and was raised up to be one of the greatest Christians that ever lived. Wow. What does that say about you and your circumstance? Don't despair. Don't be like Judas and give up. Which brings us to the last step, and that is number 5, destruction. It tells us in Matthew 27:5, and throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed, and he went, and he hanged himself. Now that's despair. That's destruction. Judas allowed despair to lead to his self-destruction. And instead of pursuing forgiveness, he gave up. God doesn't want quitters. Instead of trying to straighten out his life, he decided to end it. Folks, there is nothing worth ending your life over. There is nothing worth going to this extent. Judas hung himself from a tree and died, taking his own life because he was in such despair and he didn't feel he could come back to God and be forgiven. A lot of people think, well, he hung himself, so he's in hell. He's done. Anybody who commits suicide is going to hell. And I will tell you this, I do not see that in Scripture as a necessity. See, God knows the heart. Instead of worrying so much about that, we see that Lewis Smedes, professor of theology and ethics at Fuller Theological Seminary, was asked about suicide, and he summarized by saying this: I believe that as Christians we should worry less about whether Christians who have killed themselves go to heaven, and worry more about how we can help people like them find hope and joy in living. Our most urgent problem is not the morality of suicide, but the spiritual and mental despair that drags people down to it. Loved ones who have died at their own hands, we can safely trust to our gracious God. Loved ones whose spirits are even now slipping so silently towards death, these are our burden. When we see people in despair, we need to reach out with love. We need to try to help those people so that they don't become self-destructive. Judas's disillusionment ended in a sad display of self-destruction. And though we are all going to be disillusioned at times, it doesn't have to end that way. It doesn't have to end that way. As the worship team comes, I want to close out with a story. Disillusionment can come to the best of people. Babe Ruth had hit 714 home runs during his baseball career and was playing one of his last major league games. It was the Braves versus the Reds in Cincinnati. But the great Ruth was no longer as agile as he once had been. He fumbled the ball and threw badly, and in one inning alone, his errors were responsible for most of the 5 runs scored by the Reds. As the Babe walked off the field after the 3rd out and headed toward the dugout, a crescendo of yelling and booing reached his ears. Just then, a young boy jumped down onto the field, ran over to the Babe, hugged him by the legs. And Babe looked down, picked up the boy, hugged him, and set him down on his feet, patting his head gently. The noise from the stands came to an abrupt halt. Suddenly there was no more booing. In fact, hush fell over the entire park. In those brief moments, the fans saw two heroes. Ruth, who in spite of his dismal day on the field could still care about a little boy. And the small lad who cared about the feelings of another human being. Both had melted the hearts of the crowd. Folks, there are going to be things in our life that are going to be disappointing to other people. We're going to feel disillusioned. But you know, Scripture says that the saints are in heaven rooting us on, encouraging us as we run the race, as we fight the good fight, as we finish the course. And don't feel that it's all over. You may be down, but you're not out. Get back up. Move forward. Keep on keeping on. Don't fall into the temptation to just give up or give in. When we face guilt and despair, we can turn to another man who allowed himself to be killed for our sake, a man named Jesus Christ. And it is by his wounds that we're healed. Never give up. Never surrender.